Hey, Josh.
Hey, Renee, like a thumbs up, ready to rock and roll.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov to you. Yeah, recording Saturday night after a lovely Shabbos.
Very relaxing.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of Qabbalah questions.
Woo! Finally. All right.
They're
squeezing them in there.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions. So
all right, we'll see if we can get to all of them, but if not, we can maybe do one more after the end of the class.
Okay, so I think we should just get right into it so that we don't, so we have time for all of them.
100%.
So, first questioner says, I'm confused with the flow from human to Ein Sof. I didn't understand how it could be done with or without Sfirot. I can imagine a situation of divine energy that is affected by good or evil, i.e. goodness increases flowing divine energy. Could you please explain again the flow from human to Ein Sof?
All right, great question. I'm really glad that this person picked up on the term flow, or, it also, the terms also used are influx, in like English literature about Kabbalah. Influx and efflux. Influx means a flow into something, influx, and efflux means a flow out of something. And the terms in Hebrew are shefa, hashpa, and mashpia. So shefa is the flow itself. Hashpa actually, interestingly, in Hebrew means influence, but you actually notice that the word influence comes from the word flow, like flux. And mashpia is the bestower, the one that is flowing outwards. So there's two dynamics when we talk about the dynamics of the spheros. There's the mashpia, the flower, and the mekabel, the receiver, right? There's the one giving and the one receiving, okay? So, in the last bonus episode, we talked about the different ways of metaphorizing, right? Making a metaphor to understand the sphirot. And one of the main metaphors for it is a vertical metaphor, the tree of life, Eitz Chaim, right? In which you start at the top and it flows all the way down. Now, we problematize that for a good reason, because God does not exist in space. God is not above us, right? We're not below God, because that would then say that there's a place that God is not. But we use space as a metaphor to understand the causal relationship to God. When we say God is above us, we mean that God is a cause of something, right? Just like the top of a waterfall causes the flow to go down, okay? It's like we use gravity, in a sense, as a metaphor. Gravity means the top causes the bottom, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, one of the main metaphors used in Kabbalistic literature for the relationship between the divine and the universe is that vertical metaphor, but not just that, but a kind of spiritual plumbing in which actually, Renee, as you pointed out last week, that there are these paths or these connections between each of the sphirot. And I tacked on quickly, yes, so it's what's known as the 32 paths of wisdom. 32, of course, in gematria is leiv, heart, right? It's the word for heart. But it's 32 paths of wisdom. And you can think of them, in a sense, as 32 discrete units of plumbing, in which you have like a valve and you're turning on and turning off the flow of water, right? So like imagine last time you had a plumber in your house, or your apartment, and they have to fix the sink or the toilet or whatever, and they have to turn off the water to make sure they can get into it, right? So that's like the note, right? That we have this constant flow of the relationship between God and us, but it is able to be, as the questioner intuited, influenced, mashpia, by us below. So how does that happen? Well, the answer is basically this is exactly the role of what mitzvahs play in a Kabbalistic understanding of the Torah. Namely, when we are doing mitzvahs, when we're doing what God wants from us, that is when we're like throwing open the floodgates and letting the flow come down. And when we are doing the opposite of mitzvahs, when we're hurting each other, when we're not, activating or actualizing the Torah, then we are putting blockages into we're letting those clumps of hair, right, get into the plumbing.
Plumbing, yeah.
Yeah. So and you actually literally see, especially in later Kabbalistic literature, literally the term tzinorot used. Tzinor literally means like a tube. So back to the question of evil. So that is a way that then Qabbalah kind of accounts for human relationship, and that's what we're going to be talking about in Tuesday's class, is the human place in this question. But another side of it is so on one hand, we do good things and the flow flows, right? That sounds great. That sounds very simple, but it's not quite that simple. At least in the Zohar, especially in other Zoharic literatures, because I think you'd have to be kind of naive to think that when I'm good things happen. When I'm bad things happen. There's something more than that that's happening, right? Like we sometimes suffer things that we can't explain. And
There's
for that, the
actually-
Zohar...
Interject for a second?
Yeah, please.
There's actually another questioner who is also asking about evil. So maybe I
Great.
can
Okay, so let's put them together.
And you can answer them sort of both at the same time.
All right, great.
So regarding evil, if God is all, including opposite, then one could imagine evil also being part of God. We cannot know good without knowing evil, just like we can't know strength without knowing weakness. Yet the Torah speaks of a fall of man bringing evil. Is this before the creation of the Sefirot, during or after? Was evil the result of the shattering of the vessel, so to speak? If so, then why is it not part of the 10 Sefirot?
Okay, so here we have the question of what's called the Sitra Achra, right? The other side. But as we have kind of gestured towards a couple times in this class, it is one of the classic problems in monotheism. Namely, if there is one God and God is good, that means that God then is the cause of all things. And yet we look around and some stuff is really not good. So how is it the case then that we have these not good things in the world? What's the source? So some religions, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, have a notion that there are other gods out there, right? That they explain the bad things, right? Whether you have something that's like a dualistic religion, like Manichaeanism, right? In ancient Persia, which says that Ahura Mazda is the good god, and then there's Nyarlathotep, right? Or the bad god. That's one way of thinking about it, right? That we have like two gods, right? A good god and a bad god, and they're fighting each other. But we can't believe that in Judaism because we believe that there's one God, that the universe is ultimately, the universe was created for a good reason, right? That's part of what monotheism entails, right? That the cosmos exists for good. It's complicated, it's complex, but we believe that ultimately to exist is a good thing. And that's, I think, part of that belief. Mm-hmm. But there's a couple ways to process this. So one way is to see the existence of evil as the privation or the lack, the absence of good. In other words, there's light and there's the absence of light. The other way to look at it is to see evil as something that actually exists, right? There's light and there's dark, right? Dark is like a thing, right? Dark isn't just like you turn the light off and it's dark. Dark is actually like dark matter. It's a thing that exists. So there's a thing that exists called light or good. There's a thing that exists called dark or bad, and they are in some kind of conflictual relationship. We see both examples of that in Qabbalah, in Jewish mysticism. I'll give an example of the first one. So I'll draw from the Baal Shem Tov, from Hasidism. Now Hasidism has a number of different views on this, but a famous story from Baal Shem Tov that's quoted in the writings of his disciple, Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. He writes, imagine, or he gives a parable like the Baal Shem Tov also often does. Imagine you are trying to go to see a king, but to go to see the king, you need to go to the gate. And then the gate asks you a question, tests you, and you have to pay him off. You have to bribe him to get in. And that keeps on happening. You go through this labyrinthine maze. stage after stage, like a video game, right? Level after level to get through it. But then finally you realize that the walls were all achizas einayim. They were all an illusion. What in Hebrew literally means they seize the eye, they grab the eye, they trick you. They're really just illusory, and the walls fall away, they dissipate, and it turns out there was really nothing there to begin with, right? So the Baal Shem Tov is saying what we see as dividing us from God, evil, is actually an illusion, right? And if you're able to like fix your mind, if you're able to fix your consciousness, then you'll see actually that it doesn't really have any real existence. But that's a way of looking at evil, again, in a sense, as like fundamentally something that's like what evil is just the break from God, right? The division from God. But that in a way doesn't have a fully descriptive relationship to evil, right? Because we know that evil is not just what's keeping us from God. We see cruelty in this world, right? We see lack of compassion. We see, like people who are so insensate, right? So uncaring about the other people's well-being that they're willing to hurt them. And that kind of like theory of the Baal Shem Tov or other kind of like the evil is just the lack of good. It doesn't really, again, like it depends on what kind of state of mind you're in or whatever, but like maybe you're on that level and you really just do see things that way. But there's a reason, I think, why in Kabbalah also, like especially in the Zohar and the Zohar's related literature, that we see a more robust account for evil, that evil is something more than that. And that is a kind of a more full delving into what's called the Sitra Achra, the other side, that there's a whole nother set of spheros, and that they're actually the bad set of spheros, and they're doing bad things in the world, and that there's a struggle between them and God. Now, that having been said, they still do exist within God. Now, the questioner said, why is it the case that evil isn't one of the spheros? Well, surprise questioner, it is. Bum, bum, bum. In the Bahir, which is like the pre-Zohar book that came out in the 12th century, probably in France, it's where we first see a more like mythological account of the spheros, like that they have personalities. Right? So I didn't get into this last time, but spheros originally comes from Sefer Yetzirah. I did talk, and it originally meant 10 numbers, right? It meant like kind of the 10 basic units of the universe. But when we get into the Bahir and then to the Zohar, we see the spheros then become like God's personality, right? They have a sense of like having different characteristics or traits. So the Bahir is the first place we see that. And in the Bahir, in one, it's got a lot of different texts in it, but in the Bahir, one of the ways it accounts for the 10 spheros is instead of the sphera for Gvura or Din, instead of the sphera for judgment or strength, it literally is called Ra. It's called evil. So that, again, is a minority tradition. It doesn't get worked out. It doesn't get accepted as like Orthodox Kabbalah, whatever that is. But there is like kind of that incipient idea that that like kind of subtle idea that evil is literally one of the fundamental aspects of God. And I think that what that really is expressing is that evil is something that we witness, we experience, and it is something that is what it means for the world to manifest in the way it does. Okay. The text, the thing I want to focus on though, just like kind of, so I gave the Baal Shem Tov's like, oh, really all the walls dividing us are really just illusions, right? So that's the example in which evil doesn't really exist. The example I want to give of evil that does exist is the one the questioner gestured towards, the breaking of the vessels. Okay. We haven't really gotten into that too much. So in short, I'll say that there is a story that the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, 16th century Safidian Kabbalist, says about the way that the universe comes into creation is through tragedy. The only way for the universe to exist is for God, in a sense, to lessen God's self, because otherwise it would just be God. God had to do what's called symptom. Yeah, exactly. Contract God's self. And that's fine, fine. Maybe God's is being like nice, generous. But then another version, and then the second stage of it is like a second symptom of creating the vessels. But then the vessels being full of God's shefa, full of God's light, God's flow. Okay. But it's so strong that they end up breaking. And it's only the case that the broken vessels are a necessary component for the universe to exist. So there's something broken in the world, that the world is fundamentally broken. Now, a few minutes ago, I said like that part of the belief in monotheism is that it's good that the universe exists. It's good that we're alive. That's true. But this account by the Arizal has a more complex relationship to the idea. Namely, it is good that we're alive. It's good that we're alive because we need to bring healing to existence, because there's something fundamentally broken and hurt that we need to bring attention to, and we need to bring wholeness to. So that is, I think, a notion in which, like, it's not just the case that like evil exists, but actually, in a sense, to be alive is to account for the fact that things are messed up. Things are, to be alive at all, it means that we're not with God, that there's a distance between us and God, and that has a real impact.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have questions on that, but you know what? We're going to move on to the next questioner because there's a few questions that came in, and I just want to make sure we get to all of them.
Okay.
Okay, so this one is very interesting because it comes from, I'll just read it as it is because she explains. So the questioner, she is an educator of students with special or learning needs. It says one of my jobs is to understand how each student learns differently and how they individually perceive their reality. So if we are to, let's say, perceive God or see right, how do we know we are seeing correctly? I don't just mean people in general being different, but also about those who see their world through autistic eyes or through the distortion of mental illness or the extreme of fanaticism. With no one really the same, how do we know we are on the right track in terms of reflecting God through using our eyes, hands, etc. in the right way?
That's a great question. That's a really, really great question. So I want to push back on the notion of distortion, actually. I think one thing that is especially attended to in Kabbalah more than in other Jewish theoretical systems is that variability in perception. Because we have this idea that, in a sense, right, we've been talking consistently about this dialectic, right, this complex relationship between revelation and concealment, right? And the only way for God to reveal God's self is in some way through concealing God's self, which means that perception of God in all cases is conditional, contingent. What does it mean to perceive God then in that way? It is to provide a visible form to the invisible. That's not it's purely in a descriptive sense, so different than someone who's hallucinating. But the difference, of course, is that someone who's hallucinating is not seeing anything real, and someone who's prophesizing is seeing something real. But both of them are using their imagination to provide some kind of form, right? But then the question is, how are you actually
very individualized, right? Like, your perception of God is going to be different than mine, and an autistic child will see something different.
Right. So, right, exactly. So if we hold that there is, in a sense, a fundamental break between God and God's self, and then the way that God is perceived, right? That there is that the Ein Sof and Spheros are the same essence, but there is a different perceptual relationship between them because you cannot perceive Ein Sof. You can't even perceive below Bina, right? So if you hold that, then it has to be the case then that there are different ways in which God manifests. There are different ways in which God manifests to a perceiving individual. Not just that, but like the spheres themselves, there's that, like, it shows that God manifests God's self, God reveals God's self in varying different ways. So we have then a room for a lot more, like a wider bandwidth in terms of what it looks like. Now, but bringing that back then to maybe a little more of like the human-based question of like neurotypicality and neuroatypicality, right? Of like people who have different, the truth is, honestly, part of my learning in Kabbalah has especially sensitized me to this notion of like neurotypicality. That there is a group of ways of experiencing the world that we say are like normal. And then there's a bunch of other ways of experiencing the world that we say are abnormal. But that's a choice, right? That's a choice in terms of like what society has decided is normal, what society has decided is not normal, like what functions well in society, what doesn't function well in society, what makes people money and what doesn't make people money, right? And I think actually what I found in Kabbalah and in Hasidus especially is a wider range of what that kind of acceptable perception looks like. I'll give an example, and I'm going to use problematic language, but go with me on this. Rebbe Nachman is a poet of madness. And he sees the madman, right? The crazy person, the neuroatypical person, whatever it is, as actually having in some ways a closer relationship to God than somebody who's normal. And the reason is because God doesn't make sense. God doesn't make sense because God is above sense, right? God is above perception. God is beyond reason. And if God is beyond reason, then people who are not controlled by reason, then in some sense are able to perceive things about God that we're not. Now, I don't want to romanticize mental illness. I don't want to romanticize people with like struggles and mental disabilities and things like that. I think like you can go, they're like, oh, look, everyone who's like has like a disability is like closer to God. Like, I think that's actually like, I think everyone's close to God, right? Like the notion of like romanticizing these things is also actually like problematic and ethically suspect. But I think the point is quite right, that what Kabbalah gives us is three things, and by 3 stages. There's us down here, there's the middle ground, the mediator of the spheros, and there's like God in God's self, in the Ein Sof. And the mediation of the spheros means that all of religion exists in terms of stories. All of religion exists in terms of the ways that we're able to come up with images, metaphors, narratives, etc., about God. But those aren't actually God. So for us then to believe our stories, our neurotypicality, is then to do idolatry in a sense. And it means we need to be humble in terms of what other forms of perception look like, because other forms of perception also potentially have truth. It's a call for us, I think, to widen our bandwidth in terms of what perceptions of the real looks like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think any of that language that you used was problematic.
You talking about crazy and stuff like that, you know, like well, I'm not trying, and I'm not trying, again, I'm not trying to romanticize.
You know, what you would say now, but it's, you know, I agree, there's a better way to express that, but.
Yeah, well, I'll tell a quick story. There's a Rebbe Nachman story.
Rebbe Nachman didn't have that vocabulary or that.
Sure, you know? No, but also Rebbe Nachman's not like, you know, talking about the spectrum and stuff like that. But like, here's the story of Rebbe Nachman. Rebbe Nachman tells a story about a prince who goes crazy, and he starts dressing. He believes himself to be a chicken. He thinks he's a chicken, so he starts acting like a chicken. He starts pecking at the ground, starts eating worms, you know, whatever. The king asks the prince to sit in a chair. The prince says, clucks, whatever. He says, I'm a chicken. I don't sit in chairs. He's like, won't you eat from the table? He's like, I'm a chicken. I don't eat from the table. So he's like, sits on the table. He pecks at the ground. The king sends out, you know, an email or whatever. He's like, where's the wise person for me to, where's the doctor? Where's the psychiatrist to help cure my insane son?
Yeah.
Psychiatrists, you know, the psychiatrists come, doctors come, the rabbis come, everyone comes, and no one can do it. Everyone sees the son as a problem that they can fix, and no one can. Finally, a wise person comes, and the first thing he's led into the chamber. First thing he does is he takes off his clothes, and he goes and he sits under the table with the kid, with the prince. He's probably an adult, whatever. The prince is naked too, because the chickens don't wear clothes, obviously. So the naked prince pecking at the ground as a chicken, naked wise person sitting under the table with the prince. He says, "Hey, why aren't you eating human food?" He's like, "Well, you know, I'm a chicken. I don't eat human food." He's like, "Listen, I know you're a chicken. You know you're a chicken. They don't know what they're talking about. If you eat human food, you can still, you know, be a chicken. He's like, all right, fine. So he starts to eat human food. Finally, like step by step, he sits in a chair. He's like, listen, chickens don't sit in chairs. I know you're a chicken. You know you're a chicken. You sit in the chair. No one has to know. Fine. Finally, he gets him to put on like a shoe, a second shoe, belt, pants, etc. Finally, eventually, he is acting like a person, eating like a person, dressing like a person. But he's not. Right? The end of the story isn't, says Rabbi Nachman, the end of the story isn't that he's cured. The end of the story is that he learns how to dress like a person, eat like a person, and talk like a person again. But he knows he's a chicken.
Interesting, yeah.
That's I'm so struck by the radicalism of this story, because it's not you are cured and become neurotypical again. The moral of the story is you actually have an internal truth that other people will never understand, but the key is to learn how to cooperate and learn actually how to integrate yourself in some ways in the wider society. So it's not about the veridicality, right? The correctness or the falsity of your perception of your belief. They're all valid in some basic way. The issue really more is how are we able to cooperate with each other? And that has nothing to do with how right or wrong you are, depending on where on the spectrum you might lie.
Yeah, thankfully, I think society is changing now. They're trying to meet halfway, I think, in some ways. I hope, But anyway, that's a different discussion, and we will continue with our Kabbalah questions. So, let's see what the next question says. Okay. This is about garments. I don't remember if you were talking about this in the last class or not, but if Torah...
No, I did. No, it was one of the so it's like, woe to the person who thinks that the Torah is just stories, right? Rather, the Torah is divinity, right, in garments.
So if Torah appears in garments, then when we look for the hidden, are we not then looking at another hidden garment? This would then create a situation of perpetual searching, would it not? Making it a continual process of further revelation.
A+.
It's a good question.
I mean, listen, all these questions are amazing. Yeah. Like the beginning, like a very sophisticated understanding of like the various relations between God and creation and the way that evil influences these things, and this one, and a very like complex and mature question about like neurotypicality and whether like perception of God is plays into that. These are, man, yeah. Woo. All right, you guys teach me. Okay, garments. Basically, is it just garment after garment after garment? Is it turtles all the way down? And I think you're getting at something really right. I don't think I have like an answer. I think you're perceiving something quite right, right? When you take away a veil, you take away a veil, you take away a veil. If you took away all the veil.
It's like a mirror looking in a mirror, you just keep seeing it.
Right. Now, I mean, we do think that there is a source to the light, but if you take away the final veil, then there's no difference anymore. So you're integrated into the light, right? Like the whole point of having the veil is so you can see it. Right, like I saw actually today. This past Shabbos was Yud Tes Kislev, the Rosh Hashanah Chassidus for Chabad, right? And so I was learning Torah or from the Alter Rebbe, and he is very, very attentive to this dynamic specifically. And he says, like, we have the blinding light of the Or Ein Sof, right? We have the blinding light of the infinite, the radiance of the infinite, and the only way you can see it, he says, is if you put on sunglasses, right? The only way you can see the solar eclipse is if you use those special like glasses, the blockage to be able to perceive it. Because if you didn't use the blockage, if you took away the veils, if you took away the smoked glass or what have you, then it would burn up your retinas, right? It would do irreversible corneal damage, like a certain precedent that exists. And I don't know if everyone remembers when a certain president was looking directly at the solar eclipse and caught on camera. Yeah. Quite funny. Point being, though, is that, one way of thinking of it is in terms of epistemology, in terms of a way that we think about our experience. in which case you say the light is so bright that if we didn't have something blocking it, we would go blind. So it's theoretically possible to see it. It still exists, but it's invisible to us because it would destroy our ability to perceive it. Another way to look at it is more ontologically, more in terms of like thinking about what really exists outside of our experience. And in that case, you could say, the light is so bright that it's kind of like getting closer and closer and closer to a black hole. That like the closer you get to the black hole, you eventually reach the event horizon and you are integrated into the black hole. It sucks you into the gravity well. It compresses you into it. There's no difference between you and it. Both of those in a sense are the same point, right? That an immediate relationship to God, a relationship to God without mediation, without something, a lens, without a veil, without a garment, is impossible because you're part of it. Right? You can't see the wall if your eye is pressed up against the wall. You need distance. You need some kind of fluid mechanism, right? Or some kind of mediation to be able to perceive it. So garment after garment after garment, right? So, I mean, this is somewhat related in a sense to like tshuva, right? You can think in a sense that like, oh, I'm peeling away the garment. I'm getting closer and closer and closer to the source. But are you really then in just a sense to seeing another garment? And the garment is saying that you're closer. Now, there's a notion that you're getting closer, right? The sense of proximity to it. But it's not the notion of like there's one thing in the way and you get it out of the way and then boom, bang, you're there. The issue is rather, sorry, it's got a low battery. The issue is rather that what we have is a constant recapitulation of what it means to re-relate to God, find ourselves new bearings, find new stories, new metaphors, new images, things like that, to be able to give us vessels in which God can manifest.
Okay.
Veil after veil after veil. And the question is actually, in the words of my own teacher, actually, Elliot Wolfson, that like in a sense is the last veil, like the veil of no veils. Right? Is there no veil? Is there nothing beyond it? It's always a veil, right? Yeah.
Right. Okay. So next question.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a comment on my question, which I asked, and how we can make a difference.
It's Rashi on Renee.
Yeah, so since we are only one drop of hot water in an ocean of cold water, my thought is that one drop will have a small effect, but when added to other drops, the contribution of others, there can be a much larger effect. So as you, Josh, said regarding Maimonides' view that attempts to negate or focus on no thing, Qabbalah, in contrast, asks us to join with others to unify.
That's a very good point. Maimonides is a deeply individualistic model in which it's the sole lone philosopher contemplating God, in the purity of solitude. There's no community in a Maimonidean religion. But with Qabbalah, what we have is the encouragement to join together with each other at a number of levels. One is in terms of having these narratives, these metaphors that we can, we join together. There's also images of the collective, right? The Knesset Yisrael, the community of Israel, is one of the names of the Shekhinah. But there's a notion that God manifests in the whole, right? In the corporate entity, the corporate, community of Israel. So there is, that's again, A+ questions, all top to bottom. It really perceives that what Qabbalah gives us is, but there's another way in terms of also like behavior, right? That also in the sense of going all the way back to the first question, like what place do we have in this system? And this is what we're going to be talking about on Tuesday, is that what we have is actually the ability to re-identify with Adam HaKadmon, right, with the primordial Adam, who is said, according to rabbinic legend, to comprise every one of the 600,000 souls in Israel. Right, that Adam HaKadmon, right, Adam the first, is like kind of the proto-human being, contained inside of Adam every potential soul. Okay, so what we're able to do then is everyone has their place in terms of what it means to be part of the whole. And we all contribute in some way as a member of this larger whole. Each individual part is not just influential, but necessary. Because if one of those things are lacking, then the whole is not complete. Everyone is needed. Okay, everyone's individual is needed, yeah.
That's actually a good segue into the next question, because this questioner asks, you mentioned that we are the result of the emanation of God, that we are not the cause, that we are the effect. That made me wonder if it's possible that in some way we do cause God to exist and that God needs us as receptors so that God can be known. Just like the dilemma of if a tree falls in the forest and not is there to hear and no one is there to hear, it doesn't make a sound. Are we then necessary for God to actualize?
Yes, kind of. That was the second class. Listen, it takes time. It takes time. That was the third class. Listen, it's all seeds planted and they bloom. Like, I promise, it's working. And y'all are doing the work. That's exactly right. No, it's okay. Saying necessary vis-a-vis God is very hard. But I would say what we are in that way is an expression of God's actualization. That God, to be God in God's fullness, needs to be a creator, needs to have a creature, right? This is for God to be a mashpia, God needs a makabel. But you can flip it and say, great, but isn't part of God, the infinite, then to also be a makabel? And the answer is yes, and that's exactly our role, as we're going to be talking about on Tuesday, that we too have a role in what it means to influence this system, not just be, like our mouths open and drowning in rainwater. Beautiful, beautiful teaching from the Piasetzner Rebbe, the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he says, kind of gesturing back to this point about Adam HaKadmon and the 600,000 souls. He says the 600,000 letters in the Torah, legendarily speaking, there's more, whatever. 600,000 letters in the Torah. It is actually going back to the Ramban point, right? That the Torah needs to be every single point in it because it's all God's names. And if one letter is missing, then the God's names are screwed up, right? We don't have the names, or if something's out of order, Ein Mukdam Muchar Bar Torah, then something's screwed up. It needs to be the Torah as is, and then we can play with it, but it needs to be the Torah as is. But the Piasetzner Rebbe says, 600,000 souls of Israel, 600,000 souls, 600,000 letters in the Torah. Each person in community of Israel has their own part to play in the Torah. And if one of you is missing, he says, then the Torah is puzzle. The Torah isn't kosher. The only way for the Torah to exist, the question was asked last class, is like, when I say Torah, what do I mean? I don't mean the book. I mean this. I mean this, the Torah, God, Israel industrial complex, right? The way in which all three of these things are united. Torah is an expression of God. Torah as an expression of us. Us as an expression of God. God as an expression of Torah, right? Like, all these things are just interrelated. Kuchibrichu Yisrael Oraita Chad. These are our Trinity, right? Three things that are one, but not because they're three persons co-participating in the same essence, like in a certain other Trinity, but rather that these are three expressions of the same essence. We are all, in some sense, fundamentally united. Torah is an expression of us, God as an expression of Torah as an expression of God, and that making this mediating connection between us.
Amazing. Okay.
All right. I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah, it's a good place to end. There was one more question, but
I think we're going to punt that to next week. My phone's running out of battery.
I have an answer for this person, and I'll just say what the question is, because
Okay, great. Yeah, Renee, you do the answer.
Yeah, I can recommend a video, and it's very good, and it helped me with this exact same question. It's how did the centuries of Jews know how to be Jewish and have relationship with God prior to receiving the Torah? And I know of a really good video. It's called How do you learn Torah without having a Torah? And there was like 3 ways that you can do that. And I'm going to actually put the link in with the email. Right. Everybody can, look at it.
Let me tack in a quick addition though. Is that okay? So this is something that the commentators deal with a lot, and it's basically the question of how do you have the patriarchs and the matriarchs who, according to Midrash, kept the Torah before Kabbalah's Torah, Har Sinai, right? Like, half of the Torah happens before Har Sinai. Yeah. How do we have this idea that the ancestors of Judaism kept the Torah? So there's a few ideas. One of the ideas is that they literally kept every single mitzvah, and that's incredible. Another idea is that in some way, what Avraham Avinu and other Avos and Imahos did was they had an intuitive relationship to Torah. In a sense, they kept all the mitzvahs, but on a spiritual level rather than in a physical way, which is to say, effectively, I think it reiterates the Zohar's point. Woe to the person who thinks that the Torah is really, in a sense, the book that we read. Torah is something much bigger than that, but the way it expresses itself is in that physical literary form. So we have an example then of the Avos and Imahos, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, who were able to, in a sense, relate to the essence of the Torah, the ideas of the Torah, not just in the way that it physically manifests. It's like an angelic Torah of sorts. But what's really interesting is that, I would say this in honor of the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, but the Torah, it's not a lower form of the Torah that we have in the sense that it's in a garment. It's the fullest version of the Torah that we have. Because it says, Soif Ma'asim Machshava Tchila, right? That the action, right, the fullest physical manifestation was actually all the way in the beginning of thought. That the Torah, God has wanted us from the outset to be active co-participants in this system and to actually bring God's divinity and God's being into the world through action. That's the fullest expression. Exactly as a number of these questions have intuited, that we are an essential aspect of what this looks like because we are the actualization of God. We are, we said before, like the notion that we are a sign of God. We're God's signature in this world, right? Mm-hmm. We are making God's self manifest through us. And to realize that, it's exactly as the Sharei Ora thought, to make ourselves a throne in which God sits. It's an immense challenge, an immense task to take on, but something that I think really, again, leads us into our final class this Tuesday on what is divine about being human, what is special about what it means to be alive. And I'll see you in a couple days.
Okay, see you on Tuesday. Looking forward.
All right, good luck.
See you later.
Yeah, Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.